Anton Litvik from Ukraine.
Hi,
Now
really happy to
working
meet
without
you.
Justice
I've heard
for-
amazing things about you. It's such a pleasure to meet you. All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Carnegie. You can tell you're at a queer event because everybody's always hugging each other before everybody sits down. Welcome to Carnegie. It's a pleasure to have you all here. My name is Dan Baer. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy Research here at Carnegie, and we're delighted to host with the Council for Global Equality this conversation kind of in honor of or in tandem with the Summit for Democracy, the second Summit for Democracy that the US government, along with partners, is hosting this week. And we're particularly delighted to have a really stellar panel, both in person and virtually, with us today that includes Mark, who is the chair of the Council for Global Equality, but also Special Envoy Jessica Stern, who's sitting next to me, who's the Special Envoy for advancing the human rights of LGBTQI people at the State Department. And on screen, you'll see Victor Madrigal-Borlos, who is the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, and Tamara Adrian, who is a member of the Venezuelan parliament and a lawyer and professor. We're delighted to have you with us as well. And I think with that, we will jump into the conversation. And before we do, I just wanted to say something at the outset about the kind of nature of the main event that we're pinning this conversation to. You know, the Summit for Democracy has been something that Joe Biden talked about since before he was president, that it was an ambition of his to have this summit. And certainly he has been reliable in the last couple of years in the way that he has framed his understanding, which I take to be a genuine one to his core, because Joe Biden is almost preternaturally incapable of artifice. That we are at an inflection point in the world, and he has often framed that as that part of that inflection point as being a question of whether democracy or authoritarianism or democracy or autocracy will win out. Well, we can spend a long time debating that frame. One of the things that I think gets lost in that frame sometimes is that it gets taken up as a description of geopolitics. And those of us who have worked in the human rights community are often fond of quoting Eleanor Roosevelt and her reminder that human rights starts in the small places close to home. And one of the ways that we can tell whether human rights is making progress in the world and whether democracy is making progress in the world is how democracies are protecting those who are most vulnerable within them. And in many places around the world, the group of people, the set of people who are most vulnerable includes queer people. And that was true 15 years ago when I started working in government, and it remains true today. And perhaps no better example of that than what happened in the last 24 hours in Uganda. Aaron Sampson, who's sitting in the audience, was a political officer at the US Embassy in Uganda when I joined the State Department in 2009, and he and I and a number of colleagues worked together with Mark and others in civil society for several years to try to forestall the Kill the Gays bill, as it was called back then. And I was saying to Mark and Jessica before we came out that one of the things that's most depressing about the law that passed in the last 24 hours is that when you work in a difficult human rights beat, but one in which you believe that the arc of the moral universe is eventually bending towards justice, you know that you aren't going to win a lot of the time. But when you do win, you hope that those wins stick. And you know, there was an enormous amount of effort, not least by the civil society, the brave civil society actors on the ground in 2009, 10, 11, 12 to prevent the passage of that bill, the signing of that bill. And it's really painful to see it now passing the parliament, to see the cheers, the singing. It's painful to see how not far we've come in so long of a period of time. Victor, I thought I might start with you and see, you know, you've laid out as part of your work a three-pronged kind of framework for evaluating progress on LGBTQI human rights globally, and one of those prongs is on the criminalization of same-sex relationships. And I wonder what your immediate responses and thoughts are in reaction to the news of the day in Uganda, and how you see that fitting into global trends, and whether there's any more positive lesson or inspiration that we might take today, given the depressing note that I started us out on.
Thank you very much, Dan. And first, just allow me to start on a joyous note, which is my pleasure to be here with Mark, with Jessica, who are such dear friends and such admired persons in the movement, and with Tamara, whom I've known for such a long time, and we've been companions in many battles. And Dan, I don't think we've ever met in person, although I'm a very loyal follower on Facebook, and I surprise myself often having a lot of the same thoughts as you reveal in your Twitter page as well. So wonderful to be here with all of you. Yes, the development is actually marking a reality, but of course, hardly something that is surprising, because what we know is that there is a significant use of LGBT lives for political purposes, an instrumentalization of prejudice, which is one of the expressions that I was using on Monday when I was briefing the Security Council at an ARIA formula meeting at the invitation of the United States mission. This instrumentalization of prejudice that actually tends to be used for political purposes and to galvanize political bases, and which, in my view, actually follows a trend that is common to many latitudes in the world. Of course, the specific development is not only depressing, but extremely dangerous for our siblings in Uganda. But something that is, I think, very much in line with this idea that we can be used as pawns, as props in a political game in which the idea of this moral outrage that generates our very existence is then utilized for electoral purposes. So two of the things that I've always marked in relation to stigma and discrimination against LGBT persons around the globe, one of them is the fact that this instrumentalization is possible, and the other one is that criminalizing structures are in themselves conducive to perpetuating this type of stigma in a very vicious circle then.
The pedagogical effect of law in teaching who is deserving or not deserving of respect. Tamara, I wondered if you could join us now and say something about, you've been a trailblazer in history, one of the first people in the world, certainly one of the first people in our hemisphere to be a trans person elected to a national parliament. And I should clarify for those in the room that Tamara is from a opposition party in Venezuela. She's not part of the Maduro supporting members of the parliament, just for clarification. And I wonder what you could say about what the experience of running for office as a trans person, Victor commented on the way that we are politicized, our being is politicized. I wonder whether you could comment on what you learned about democracy in running as a trans person for parliament, and maybe what you learned about being queer.
Okay, I would say that thank you very much, first and all, for this opportunity, and also, as well as Victor said, to be together with the people that I admire and I love very much. And both Jessica and Mark have been friends for many, many years now. It was a quite interesting experience to run for office in a country in which there is no democracy. And actually, that was the last somehow free election, and not fair. Nonetheless, the opposition in that election 2015 was able to obtain the two-thirds, the majority of two-thirds of the chamber. This is the unique chamber in Venezuela. And what I have learned of this experience is that to be engaged actively in the change of social and cultural and legal conditions concerning LGBTQI people as well other vulnerable populations needs for action, and this action can be achieved either by being part of civil society and also by being part of the political movement. And they are not in contradiction. They are two ways in which you try to get the same result. And very briefly, now in this moment, very 7 years after having run for the position, certain number of people belonging to civil society consider that I am a person engaged in politics, therefore that I am no longer civil society, and other think that I am the people that are in politics thinks that I think too much in the way civil society does. And the reason is that I do not see a contradiction. What I see it's an alliance that is needed in order to promote the change and to start to move the wheel of change in various and difficult environments.
Thank you. I think a suspicion of forced categorization can be something that unites us all. Mark, I wanted to ask you, since we are looking forward to the events of next week with the Summit for Democracy, one of the things that your organization has done is to create a kind of scorecard or a dashboard of countries around the world and how they're doing on human rights for LGBTQI people. And one of the things that we often repeat is that the condition of, and I did it in the opening, but the condition of LGBTQI people or other vulnerable people in a particular society can be a kind of canary in the coal mine in terms of the condition of human rights more generally and also the trajectory of a society. And I wondered whether you think that's true. We repeat it, but is it actually the case that these are a leading indicator, that the crackdowns that we see, the backsliding that we see on queer rights is actually reflective of broader trends?
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and it's great to be here and to co-host this discussion with all of you. I think our scorecards show that the canary in the coal mine analogy is true. We wanted to actually empirically show that it's true, and I think our scorecards do. What we did is we took all the 110 countries that were invited to participate in the last Summit for Democracy, most of whom we expect to participate in this Summit for Democracy, and we scored them on 30 different indicators in 3 different areas. So on basic human rights, one of the largest, most important indicators are whether a country has decriminalized consensual same-sex relationships and recognizes the gender identity of its transgender citizens. So that's one category of basic rights. We also looked at protection from violence as another category, and then socioeconomic rights, the ability to participate in the economic life of a country. And on those 30 indicators, we found that there's a strong correlation between countries that received high grades, that received an A on our scorecards, and countries that are considered to be strong democracies as rated by the Economist Intelligence Unit or Freedom House, Freedom in the World. There is a very strong correlation. And I think that's not surprising, right? That's what we all anticipated. What I think is interesting in the scorecards, and just a quick plug for the report cards, you can find them on our website at globalequality.org. You can look up any of the 110 countries that should be participating. But the interesting aspect to the data, when you dig really deeply, I think, is that LGBTQI plus individuals are obviously benefiting from democratic dividends, right? They are living more prosperous, safe, and secure lives in democracies. But the data, I think, is starting to show that LGBTQI citizens and organizations are actually drivers of democracy, right? So they're both benefiting from the dividends of democracy, but also agents of change that are promoting and building healthy and secure democracies. And I think that's important, and as depressing as Uganda is today, and our hearts go out to our friends and colleagues fighting that fight in Uganda, I think we see in a country like Uganda that the strength of the LGBTQI community, and there is a strong, vibrant civil society in Uganda that is fighting the bill, that fought the bill when it passed 10 years ago, and eventually, with support from the international community, was able to overturn that bill. And they're fighting, they're stronger than they were 10 years ago, they're going to fight again, and they are ultimately helping to lay the foundation for a prosperous, inclusive democracy one day in Uganda. We're far from it, unfortunately, today, but they are building that democracy as we speak. So it's hard to be optimistic, but that is the most optimistic spin, I think, on Uganda today, and I think what our report cards are starting to reveal.
When I was at the State Department, one of the hardest parts of assessing the condition on the ground for LGBTQI people was that obviously in the hardest places, people are least able to speak up. And so it makes it much more difficult to get a sense of how people are. One of the other efforts that CGE has undertaken is a kind of survey that tries to get at how people actually experience the societies in which they live and whether they feel safe, fundamental questions to their personal security, et cetera. I wonder if you could say a bit about what you've learned through that work as well, and whether there were any surprising findings, either positive or negative, in that regard.
Yeah, there were. Thank you, Dan. So the LGBTQI human rights report cards, we launched that at the first Summit for Democracy 2 years ago, and we've rescored all the countries for this year. So there's 2020 report cards, and then the current report cards, which are based on 2022 data. But this year, we added another component. We added a perception index. So we surveyed over the summer 168,000 people in those countries and asked them 6 basic questions about how safe and secure they feel in those countries. A very short survey so that we could get it out broadly, but I think it was really interesting. And what we wanted to get at, and I think the outliers are important, is in what countries do people feel less safe and secure than the legal framework might suggest? And then the opposite is also really interesting. In what countries is the community reporting greater levels of safety and security or greater comfort in society than the legal framework should suggest? And I think both of those outliers are really interesting. The countries, 2 examples of countries where there's a very strong legal framework, they get an A on our report cards, are Canada, Greece, and Malta, three of the highest scoring countries, actually. But on the safety and security perception index, they get C's and D's, so much lower than what we would expect from the legal framework. Then interestingly, on the other side, I think the Philippines is the most interesting. They get a very low score in terms of national legal framework, but a quite high score in terms of the perception index. And obviously there's a thriving, vibrant LGBTQI plus community in the Philippines that thrives and survives and perseveres despite the legal context. And I would argue are drivers of the democratic process and the democratic renewal in the Philippines. So I do think matching the report card scores with the perception scores is really interesting in terms of looking at the overall picture of a community.
Thanks. Jessica, last week, Secretary Blinken introduced the latest version of the country reports on human rights practices, otherwise known as the human rights reports that the State Department issues every year on every country around the world except ourselves. And I wondered whether, one of the observations, this connects also to what I was saying at the outset, one of the observations that if you take a step back, you might say about the United States is that in 2010, 11, 12, through Obergefell, it felt like we were in this kind of moment of enormous leap forward, which is not to say that everything was fixed, but that there was a real wave of progress sweeping across the country. And when I was working on the human rights reports, when they were first starting to include the conditions for LGBTQ people around the world, it was a moment where it felt like things were pretty bad, but if they were changing year to year, they were getting better. And in the United States, certainly one of the things that there's been enormous deserved attention to in recent years is the physical threats, the life-threatening threats against particularly trans women of color in this country. Obviously, we have a wave of new legislation that is banning certain forms of gender expression or banning certain forms of expression more generally. So we've seen a kind of swing back in the United States. And I wonder whether you see anything as you look at this year's human rights reports that would suggest a similar kind of backlash internationally.
Thanks for the question, Dan, and thanks also to you and Carnegie for creating this space and to the council for inviting me. It's good to be here with everyone in the room, everyone watching online, and hello, Victor and Tamara. I wish we were in the room together. But whatever room you're in, I'm sure is the room to be in. So Dan's question is a good one. It's the perennial question. Are we going forward or backwards in the struggle for the human rights of LGBTQI plus persons, and how do you know? Like, what is the standard of success when you're fighting for dignity, respect, recognition before the law, and lives free of violence? So it's a really hard question. And I would say if you're looking at the HRRs, the human rights reports, as a data set, it's an incomplete data set. And we actually can't answer that question because we don't have that many years of thorough reporting on LGBTQI rights. We're getting better each year, but there's still a long way to go. I remember when I was reviewing the draft chapters for some countries, you would read, voluminous essays about human rights violations against certain groups, and then you'd get to the LGBTQI section and there would be like 2 sentences. So that's when my office comes in and we say, this is a great start. But it's a good opportunity to meet with the LGBTQI community. And I think certain countries are assumed to not be problem countries and other countries are assumed to be the ones where there's a rights deficit. But actually, there's no country on the planet where LGBTQI people are safe or live with the security they need. I think we're in a peculiar moment where there actually are a lot of wins to celebrate. In the last year, more countries decriminalized homosexuality than any other year I can recall. 4 countries, one being Singapore, which of course did it through executive action in partnership with a parliamentary strategy that came as the result of years of tenacious activism by local advocates and a court strategy. And the other, which was a slow and systematic strategy through the courts of the Caribbean. So that's a huge win. And there was a time when people would say, you could never imagine decriminalization in the Caribbean. But now, of course, the Caribbean is actually on the vanguard. And a lot of us are learning from the Caribbean. On the flip side, we also documented more harmful abuses of intersex persons and unnecessary surgeries than we ever have before. More examples of the practice known as corrective rape, and more instances of conversion therapy. And part of the reason we documented more of those cases is because community members told us that we needed to ask those questions and we needed to search for the data. So I would say it's hard to get a sort of aggregate data set, but I want to name 3 challenges because I think what the US government is able to produce in terms of this human rights record is linked to 3 broader questions from a research agenda. Since I happen to know you're in charge of research at Carnegie, I'm always trying to support more data collection about LGBTQI rights. So one thing is, we don't have enough data about LGBTQI issues. And that's why I think the scorecards and attitudinal surveys by CGE are so important. Another point that I want to make is that we actually, I think in mainstream institutions and governments are definitely one space where you see this, we actually just don't have a keen enough awareness of how deep the discrimination and violence goes. I think it's well understood at the community level, but even when we worked on the human rights reports, I would sometimes see draft submissions that would say there are no official documented cases of violence against LGBTQI people in this country. And the official data set may be blank, but the community data set is rife with examples. And then just the third and final point that I want to make on this is that I think there's been a lack of investment by governments in trying to unearth this data. And until we start having official data collection, we're going to continue to underserve LGBTQI people in policies and programs.
Yep. Point well taken, and certainly that's part of what I was talking about in terms of the challenges of getting an accurate sense of what's going on the ground. And I do think the perception index can be a kind of guide to where more mining should be happening, a good clue. Tamara, I wanted to come back to this non-division between being, at least non-division of the self, between your past as a civil society activist, an advocate, and your present as an elected deputy in the parliament. One of the things that Victor has worked on is a framework for trans identity, for recognition of trans identity, that lays out what a human rights respecting approach to that would be by governments. And one of the things that I remember being asked, I worked on the first resolution at the Human Rights Council recognizing the human rights of LGBTQ people. And people, when I found it deeply moving. I remember crying the day that it finally passed, as I'm sure, and I know I wasn't alone in that chamber. But one of the things when I was trying to explain to people back home is they would say, why does that matter? Why do international standards matter? What does that do? And I wonder whether you could say something about whether the work of Victor and others in the international community to set international standards, how you, either as a civil society activist in your past life or as a deputy in your present life, how you incorporate that into your advocacy and your work.
Okay. The work in every single space is needed, and the possibility to have instruments that serve the purpose of presenting to those who are against our rights that the international standards go in another way, the way they think. It's very important. And for that purpose, for instance, the standards or the decisions of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights recognizing that the right to a proper identity, a legal identity, is a human right under the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights, as well as the right to marry. I think they are very important instruments as long as you have people that are willing to hear and to be convinced. And the situation in Uganda in this moment shows that there are people that do not want to be convinced, but what they want is to propagate hate and use hate as the instrument to get the power. And in many places, including the United States, in many legislature of the United States as well as other countries, the use of hate and the use of wrong ideas about what being a trans person is or being a gay person is, the use of misinformation, the use of the theory of panic and social panic has been a way to create in this moment this controversy that has been rising in many countries, including Spain, where I am now in this moment, or other countries. By fortune, in Spain, a few weeks ago, it was possible to finally approve the new gender identity law in which the standard is to recognize the legal identity of trans people on self recognition and not by pathologizing identities. But what I see is that there is a global movement, very well conceived, very well financed, very well organized, that it's trying to make recede, backlash all the advancements we have get in the past years, and to impede in those countries in which these advancements have not been achieved, that those laws for equality are adopted. So we have to be very aware of where we are and organize again. Because what I thought for the movement just a few years ago is that many people thought that they were um, in a safe haven where they got rights, recognizing the right to marry, the right for a legal identity, and they took it for granted. And they never thought that they could have backlashes and that those rights could be threatened.
Thank you. Victor, I wanted to ask you about your process. So for gender identity, your three-pronged approach is that it should be self-determined, that it should be not bureaucratically onerous, and that it should be financially accessible, not expensive. When you're coming up with a framework like that, how do you do that? And also, do you speak to the other IEs, the other special procedure mandate holders that work on other aspects of human rights as you're kind of coming up with your own remit, your own work?
Well, thank you for that question, which of course allows me to elaborate a little bit on the way in which these standards have been identified. So let me start by talking a little bit about the process. We all acknowledge that we reunite many identities in one body. There are, of course, many expressions about how we don't live single issue lives, but rather rich lives that are determined by multiple identities, and that it is our placement in a particular intersection of those identities that determines whether we have great privilege in few cases or in most cases, experiences of discrimination and violence. And of course, all that this means is that when examining particular problematics of human rights, each one of the mandates of the United Nations is given a point of entry into this analysis. In my case, I am given the point of entry of sexual orientation and gender identity as a way to understand that richness in people's lives that is determined in very many cases also by race and socioeconomic status, migratory status, nationality, and many, many other factors. And that is what is known as intersectional approaches, the understanding that that richness in the analysis is necessary to understand particular placement in that vector of discrimination and violence. Of course, in order to do this, I actually have a lot of conversations with other mandate holders that work on different vectors as well. And I think one of the great honors that I have is that I'm one of the mandate holders that is able to work with most other mandates, because it is recognized that everybody has a sexual orientation and everybody has a gender identity. And therefore, I am, of course, able to work in many, many of those intersections. When it comes specifically to gender identity, there is reliance on this concept of gender, which has become part of international human rights law and international law, many disciplines of international law, international criminal law, international humanitarian law, by means of the recognition of the reality that there are very many stereotypes and functions and a particular meaning that is attached to sex in different societies and in different point in time, and that is in relation to the placement of those stereotypes and expectations. that people fall within norms of what is expected to be quote unquote desirable or quote unquote normal in relation to gender, or they are placed in a situation where they are seen as transgressive in relation to those norms. So the reception of this concept of gender in international law has created a protection of the decisions that people take in relation to gender, and of course, the ability of people to determine the confines of their own existence, which is the way in which I have understood gender identity and gender expression. And so all of this conceptualization, which is a very strict legal analysis of the international frameworks, have allowed me to conclude that gender identity and therein gender expression are protected categories, protected traits that actually determine people's protection from discrimination and violence, and therefore lead to the recognition of their ability to be legally recognized as in relation to the choices that they take in relation to gender.
Thank you. I should have said at the outset that Victor also teaches at Harvard Law School, but he's already demonstrated that in the clarity of his answer. Thank you, Victor. I want to turn back to the room, and I'm going to open up for questions, both from people online. You should be able to submit questions online as well as people in the room, and somebody's going to bring me an iPad that will have those questions on them momentarily. But before I do, two quick questions for Mark and Jessica. First, Mark, I wanted to ask you, the next week's Summit for Democracy is supposed to cover three themes, one of which is human rights, and it's quite obvious to see how our conversation fits into that. But the other two are countering corruption and authoritarianism. And I wonder how you see, as you do your work, working with a range of civil society organizations, how you see LGBTQI human rights as connecting to those two other themes of the summit.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And actually, the LGBTQI human rights report cards we prepared, we've also done an analysis to correlate them to corruption indicators. And I should pause for 1 second. I should have, at the outset, recognized that our partners in collecting this data for the report cards are F&M Global Barometers, and they are brilliant data gurus, and we really appreciate their help in preparing all of this. But so when you look at the report cards, there's also a strong correlation, as you might expect, between countries that score well in terms of low corruption scores on most global indicators, and countries that score high on protection for their LGBTQI citizens. That's not surprising, because when we think about it, in the 60-some countries that still criminalize consensual same-sex relationships, a majority of those countries are not actually arresting and prosecuting people, although there are certainly many that are. But in almost all of those countries, those laws form the basis for extortion, right? So police are harassing people, detaining them, and demanding bribes to be released, or their families come in and pay bribes so that they are released, or their neighbors threaten to report them to the police unless they pay a bribe. So the criminalization of same-sex relationships and gender identities is a huge driver of corruption. In fact, I think many have speculated that one of the reasons these laws are so entrenched is because they have real benefit for the police and others who can use them to supplement what is often a very low income in many countries that criminalize, right? So there's a very strong and powerful correlation between corruption, democracy, and the rights of LGBTQI plus citizens. And I think, based on that earlier conversation we had about the relationship between democracy and the rights of LGBTQI persons, we do see, again, the strong correlation between countries that are authoritarian and countries that persecute their communities, the LGBTQI plus community. But also, again, that ray of hope that in places like Uganda, where we see strong LGBTQI civil society, we do see groups that are standing up and fighting for democracy and are fighting authoritarianism. So I would argue, and we have some funders in the room, that investing in LGBTQI plus civil society has incredible democracy dividends and anti-corruption dividends. And I think that should be a takeaway from this Summit for Democracy.
Great. Jessica, I want to finish with you, and then I'm going to go to questions from the audience. But a last question for you, and this is a tricky one, and I apologize. But one of the things...
Okay, so...
one of the challenges that I remember, and that I'm sure you experience, is that when you see things like the copycat laws of Russia's so-called gay propaganda laws, which are replicating around the world, and including in this country, in different incarnations, when you see things like democratic, free, not fairly elected parliaments, like the parliament in Uganda, passing new legislation through what appear to be, popular processes, and it is probably true that popular opinion supports that in various places. How do you think about how the U.S. government can effectively intervene or take action without being vulnerable either in perception or in reality to the criticism of being neocolonial, imposing Western values? How do you think about that challenge?
I think those are really essential questions to answer because, of course, the U.S. has had an outsized footprint around the world, and we have to grapple with that and contend with that and be responsible for that when we engage in fighting for the rights of vulnerable and marginalized people. We carry that history. I mean, if we talk about intersectionality, and we mean it, we actually have to look at the areas where our human rights agenda is not universally lauded. So I want to just sort of start with the principle of humility. I think we can talk about governments and countries that are broadly democratic, but then we have to go to a deeper conversation about and ask the question, how democratic? So if there's not a single out LGBTQI person in a parliament, how strong is the democracy? If there's not a single LGBTQI organization that can legally register, how strong is the democracy? If the only speech you hear by government officials tramples on the rights of LGBTQI people, how strong is the democracy? So I think it's really important to say that in some countries that identify as democracies, LGBTQI people have been deprived of the opportunities to participate fully in those democracies. And of course, to just use some of the most essential laws as a baseline, when you live in a country where sodomy is against the law or trans people don't have a pathway to legal gender recognition, how do you fully participate in the electoral processes and rights and responsibilities of citizenship? I would argue that you can't. I would argue that's a flawed democracy. So I start with concepts like that. I spent my career as a human rights defender, and now I'm in government, and it is schizophrenic. I loved hearing Tamara talk about it. It's like in government, I'm seen as too civil society, and in civil society, I'm now this weird government person. So it's very interesting to have a sort of duality of lived experience. But I would just say, I think one of the shocks that I had coming into government is how much governments actually talk to each other behind closed doors about everything. We talk about national security. We talk about climate. We talk about money. We talk about health. We talk about everything. And so if we're not talking about LGBTQI rights, we're leaving something really important out of the conversation. One of the other things that shocked me about coming into government is how often I'm asked to be an expert in US LGBTQI history. There is not a country that I've gone to where I haven't been asked, what happened after Obergefell? You know, what is it like now that you have X gender markers on your passport? And it's an honor, actually, to share that knowledge and to say, even though we have equal marriage in the United States, heterosexual people still exist. They still get married, and they're thriving, right? So giving people rights doesn't take away rights.
I could send you some TikTok channels that would probably challenge that assertion, but yeah.
Well, based on what you and Victor are saying, I need to be following your social media, Dan. But
I'm not on TikTok.
but not yet. Anyway, I just want to say, I think there are lots of ways that the U.S. can express our values. First of all, I think it is our obligation to reflect the values and principles of our laws. And that includes fighting for LGBTQI equality around the world. That is our national story. I think that one of the best things we can do, which is why I smiled so broadly when Mark emphasized his points about funding being essential, is lifting up local LGBTQI civil society voices, full stop. Investing in LGBTQI movements is the way to ensure the most lasting and secure social change. And then I would just say, one of the things that's been a real pleasure since I got into this role is I get to participate in bilateral strategic dialogues about a broad range of issues that the US and our partner countries discuss. And typically when I ask the question, how much are we spending, how much of the agenda is about human rights, the answer is, since you asked, why don't we include more? So I just want to say governments are talking about these issues, and it's our responsibility to make sure LGBTQI rights are on the agenda.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience, and I think the first one probably is for you, Victor, which is, how can trans people use international law to challenge anti-trans laws being passed at the state level in the United States? And Tamara, you may have advice on this as well.
Well, I think that what we know from international and comparative strategic experiences is that there's a number of instruments within democracy that one can trigger, and its reliance on precisely the division of powers and systems of checks and balances that create these opportunities. So Jessica was mentioning how the strategy in the Caribbean has been carefully crafted, and it has been slow. And part of the success of that strategy is that local stakeholders and human rights defenders have chosen, whether it was executive public policy or access to justice through court decisions or legislative action, which was the appropriate tool in a given context. And this is what connects very fundamentally with democratic institutionality, is that idea of division of power and the subjection of all powers in the state to the rule of law, which of course then connects with democratic principles established constitutionally. And you can begin to see a whole framework of governance which gets extremely dangerously eroded when the institutions begin to co-opt each other, which is why, of course, co-option of the courts is such a dangerous thing, and co-option of parliaments is such a dangerous thing, as we have seen in many latitudes around the world. So trans people see the opportunities in those settings. For example, in Argentina, most of the change, we know that Argentina has great legislation, but the change began by access to justice, by visionary judges that actually ascertained the right of trans people under the American Convention on Human Rights to have legal recognition of gender identity. In countries such as Costa Rica and Colombia, it has been administrative action through their civil registries and programs such as the Inter-American Program of Citizenship, the PUICA. And in other countries, it has been through legislation directly. We see that combination. The key of all of those aspects is the knowledge of local human rights defenders in what is that can work at the same time or at the appropriate time. And very importantly, of course, when in situations where you don't have true independence of powers, where you have co-option of the powers, you see significant erosion of these opportunities. And of course, that's where democracy and governance actually begin to show the erosion of also the respect for human rights that is such a necessary component.
Great, great, thank you. If people in the room have questions, there are roving microphones, so raise your hand. I want to throw another question out there to whoever on the panel wants to pick it up, but one of our questioners points out that some of the bright spots in the last few years in terms of progress for LGBTQI human rights have been places that aren't actually great democracies or haven't made enormous democratic progress. Places like Thailand or Vietnam or Cambodia that all have flaws on a number of measures. How does that complicate our understanding of kind of the connection between protections for human rights for LGBTQI people and democracy?
I'm happy to start. I think, I think to my earlier point, I think what our human rights report cards are showing, right, that LGBTQI civil society groups are agents of democracy. So you do see in those countries vibrant LGBTQI communities. And interestingly, in some of those communities, Cambodia, Vietnam, LGBTQI civil society is more vibrant than other sectors because they're allowed some level of room to function, whereas pro-democracy groups are not, and other anti-corruption groups are not, right? So they actually have a little more space in some of those countries, and they are, again, slowly building democracy as they demand their own rights and their ability to participate as citizens. So I think those are unique. I think China is the flip side of that, where we saw there was some opening for a while in China where there were LGBTQI civil society groups that were truly sort of community-level organizing groups, and they're now being crushed, just like everyone else in China, right? So China has decided, with Xi in Russia now, to take, a very different approach to the LGBTQI community, and that space has been crushed, and the hope of democracy in China is so much further forward, I think.
Another question for anybody on the panel who wants to jump in is picking up on the problem of data collection. One of the places that that official statistics are drawn from is obviously police reports, and those are rolled up at the national level and published, and obviously where the police don't care about or where laws don't protect people from certain abuses, then those abuses are not registered. Do you have ideas for what best practices there could be? Is that a place where there's space for practical work, and what would the best practices be for trying to improve the quality of reporting, given the challenge that the reporting is bubbling up from police reports?
I think we're far away from a world where we're going to get all of the data that we want from police. And I think we have to acknowledge the historical mistrust that many LGBTQI communities and other marginalized groups have of police. Police have often been the perpetrators of violence against LGBTQI people, and in many countries are responsible for arbitrary arrest. One of the patterns that we see that often produces bad data from police is the misgendering of trans and non-binary people who are victims of violence. I don't think there's one answer to that. I think it's an enormous problem, Dan. I think one of the solutions is we need to invest more in NGOs collecting data. We also need to resource academic institutions that have the air of objectivity, even though if you know any academic, they are totally as subjective as NGOs. But they do churn out credible data that's used. And I also think we need data from multilateral sources. I think there's a real effort underway to queer data collection everywhere. And one of the places that I find most exciting is the work to bring LGBTQI inclusive practices into national census review. And there are some countries that are doing this work. It's being done in fits and starts. There's been some great work done in Nepal and Kenya, but also I think bringing a national statistical body to the place where they actually can get good data is very hard. So I was in Nepal not long ago, and I met with some of the members of the National Census Board, and they said, we really want LGBTQI inclusion in our census. We're making a considerable effort. And I was so thrilled because, of course, in the United States, we don't have an LGBTQI inclusive census. So there's a lot to be learned from governments that are making an effort. And so I asked, how do you collect the data? And they said, well, our census collector will go and knock on a door, and the person who answers, or the head of household, will then complete the survey for the entire household. And I could just imagine the queer kids in that family, kind of like peering over the banister or peering out from the kitchen and wondering how their gender identity was going to be reflected, or how their dreams about their future would be told. So I think I have a little bit more hope that we can do better in national census data collection than in some of the other institutions where we have so much trust building to do.
Sounds good. We are really up against time. Victor, I see your hand up, so I'm going to ask you to chime in on this. But I'm going to start with you, Victor, and you can chime in on what you wanted to say on the last question. But I would like to ask all of the participants in our panel to give a 30-second closer and address the topic of the conversation today was meant to be advancing inclusive LGBTQI citizenship globally. And I wanted to ask you all to say a few words on what citizenship means to you in that context. Victor, over to you first, and then we'll go to you, Tamara.
Thank you very much, Dan. Very quickly to Jessica's fantastic information and answer in relation to the issue of data. I wanted to connect with some of the principles which were identified by the mandate in its report, which has a lot of good practices compiled from inputs from states. And it's the principle of lawful use of data, which is the way that data is gathered and is used needs to be determined by law. And that, of course, is what connects with the rule of law and, again, with democratic governance. And I think a lot of the arbitrariness that we see and the risks to which Jessica was making reference actually relate to when that framework is not in place. As to your question, I'll just take 10 seconds to say, when states are actually signaling this idea of criminalization or pathologization, really what they're saying is what they understand by proper citizenship. And this is why it's so important to dismantle criminalizing, pathologizing, and otherwise stigmatizing structures, because we need to ensure that proper citizenship is acknowledged for all LGBT persons within the framework of democratic governance.
Tamara, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I
No.
was muted. I just will say that for me, data, it's one of the most important things and one of the most difficult things. Therefore, there will be we would need to put in place a very large system of alliances in order to gathering data, because NGOs can gather some data that cannot be gathered by governments, etc., etc. So let's think about what kind of alliances are needed in order to get these data available in the future. And to finalize, I guess that I might be a little not completely, but a little very positive in the sense that if you study history, around 70 years elapsed between the first country that abolished slavery and the last country that abolished slavery. 120 years, 115 years elapsed between the first country that granted the right to vote to women and the last one. So I guess that in the future, we must see a world in which equal rights will be the rule, but as well as if racial segregation was abolished, racism still in place, or women have achieved in most of the countries equal rights, nonetheless, gender-based violence exists and succeeds. And the social change for equal rights might be much more difficult to achieve.
Thank you. Mark?
Thanks, Dan, and thanks again for hosting us today. I love the concept of LGBTQI plus citizenship because I think it's dynamic and it reflects a two-way street, right? It talks about the obligation of governments to provide rights to LGBTQI citizens, to provide that legal framework that we've been trying to grade. But it also talks about the ability of LGBTQI citizens themselves, individuals, to participate in their government, to create the society that they want to see and that will ultimately shape their democracy, right? So it's a dynamic, empowering concept that shows that we, LGBTQI persons, are in control of our fate ultimately, and we are building inclusive democracies, even in places where it's awfully hard at the moment.
Thank you. Jessica?
Dan, I'd like to request to never go after Martin. It's such a hard question.
But you get to go before me.
Well, that's a saving grace. I just want to say it's a hard question because it's a question that invites us to dream. What does it want? What does it look like for us to all matter? And of course, we're not just sitting here as people that care about LGBTQI rights. People in this room care, virtual and actual room, we care about racial justice, we care about gender equality, we care about immigrant rights. So, full citizenship means breaking down so many of the barriers that we live with today. So I'm tempted to rattle off a list because I love a list, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say I think full citizenship requires an enormous reimagination of what's possible, where all people matter.
Excellent. I want to take the opportunity to thank the Council for Global Equality again for pulling together this event, for co-hosting, and thank our wonderful panelists for a really illuminating conversation. And may it be inspiration for the many, many people from government and civil society who will gather over the next week to talk about how we can take our democracies and the protections of human rights forward in the world. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for joining.